Good morning, everybody. I'm fresh back from camp with them as well. It was a blast. You should absolutely grab one of them and ask them more about the experience. They may not want to talk about it or tell you they don't, but they do. They had an awesome time. So we'll jump right in. How important are our rights? What are some rights that you have? Throw some out for me. What are some rights y'all have? That's fact. Second Amendment, that's guns, freedom of guns. So y'all are hitting hard the Bill of Rights, which is 10 things. Does anyone know all 10? Pop quiz. First one, religion, speech, assembly. Second one's bear arms, rawr. Third one, you are free from forced quartering of soldiers in your home. The Army can't make you house soldiers in your house. Interesting, yeah? Fourth one, free from unreasonable search and seizure. That's a really big deal. Fifth, you're free from unfair criminal proceedings or unfair due process. Six, you are entitled to a fair trial and access to a lawyer. 7, in civil cases that involve sums more than $20, you're entitled to a trial by jury. 8, you are entitled to fair bail, fines, and punishments. 9 talks a lot about the people's rights of the country, and 10 talks about states' rights. We've got an entire document that speaks to the rights that we as citizens of America possess, and I'm not firing shots at anybody because I'm included in it as well, but most of us don't even know what it says. I think that says a lot about a couple of things having to do with how we interact with our rights. One, I think most of us, it says, we're wildly uninformed or underinformed about what rights we have. And two, for the most parts, for most of us, our rights are conditionally important. We understand we have some rights, and we may know a little bit about a few of them, but until we feel like our rights are challenged, we really don't care a whole lot about knowing about them. But when we feel like our rights are challenged, it becomes a really big deal to us. Something I used to hear all the time, in quotes, "You can't do that," whatever that was, "I have rights." And it's usually nothing specific, just kind of a statement that I generally know I have some rights, and I don't like what you're doing right now, so clearly you are infringing on them. I've got a picture, some background maybe. There I am. For those of you that didn't know, I was a police officer for a long time, for about 15 years in the fine city of Dallas. I am cheesing real big in that picture. I had some cool, more action-y pictures that I wanted to use, but Selena told me no. So this is actually right after lunch outside of a restaurant. That's why I'm so happy, probably. So, as a police officer, when you're arresting somebody, you are taking away their freedoms. You're seizing some of their rights. And that's usually a moment where they start to care a whole lot about the rights they do have and defending them adamantly, whether they know what they are or not. A super common one that I heard all the time is, "You can't take me to jail. You haven't read me my rights." Who many people have seen a TV show or a movie where the police read someone their rights? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, right? That whole thing. You have a right to an attorney. If you can't get one will be appointed for you. So these are called the Miranda rights, or your Miranda warning, right? It stems from a kidnapping and murder case with Ernesto Miranda back in the 60s in the state of Arizona. They caught him and arrested him, and they took him to an interrogation room, and that one-on-one with the detective, like on the first 48, and he confesses to it. They go to trial. His lawyer makes the argument that his confession is inadmissible because he wasn't aware of his rights to have an attorney present, to have legal representation. So the case goes all the way up to, they put a hold on the criminal trial. Case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agrees. They're like, yeah, y'all didn't tell him he had the right to an attorney to be there. So they throw the case out. We get the Miranda warning from that. Side note, he does get retried and found guilty based off witness testimony. He was a bad dude. That's a good thing. But now we read people their Miranda rights prior to a custodial interrogation. Now, that's a very specific term I just used, and it's something you may not know what it is, but the common misconception is that when you get arrested, the police read you your rights, and that is entirely untrue. Generally speaking, you will probably never have your rights read to you if you get arrested. The only time it'll happen is if you get arrested and taken to a police station where you're in that interrogation room with detectives in that kind of one-on-one situation. It's incredibly rare to be read your rights in the field. As a matter of fact, myself, I have never read anyone their rights, 15 years of being a police officer. But people claim it as a right because they see it, they know that it exists, they know that it's a protection they have, but they don't know the details of the situation when it's used, right? They know it exists, but they don't know the specifics of it, right? And generally, like I said, we don't care enough to learn those details until we feel like that right's being infringed. So let's narrow our focus a little bit as we move forward. What rights does the Bible say we have? Any thoughts? Does it say you have the right to happiness, to prosperity, the right to judge others, the right to not be judged yourself, the right to be offended or angry when someone wrongs you, the right to seek justice for that wrong? Let's explore what Jesus has to say on the topic. So today we're going to be in Matthew 5, 38 through 42. Goodbye, Coit. Put the whole one up there, if you got it. Maybe? No? Oh, that's fine. That's fine. I gave it to Alyssa at the last moment. She did the best she could with what I gave her. I put her in a crunch. It's all good. We'll start. That's where we're starting. So give y'all some time to get there. We're finally back in the Sermon on the Mount. Who's excited? Woo! Yeah, that's more people than I thought were going to cheer. So I think it was early last December when we put a pin in our Sermon on the Mount series. We kind of swung into Christmas, and we've danced around through a few other things since then, but now we're back to kind of finish it out. So as y'all flip there, get your phones turned on, I'll give you a bit of a refresher. Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is standing atop this. It would be a mountain to us here in Texas, but it's a large hill for the area. Speaking to a large crowd that's gathered to hear him. This crowd is primarily Jewish people, and it's the full strata of society, everyone from Pharisees and Sadducees down to beggars and blind men, right? Throughout the Sermon on the Mount, up to this point and continuing, we see that Jesus is following this kind of consistent structure as he juxtaposes the laws of Moses and how they were practicing them at the time with practical examples of how the Jewish people should in reality be walking these laws out. And generally, at every step, he increases the expectation placed on the people by the Mosaic laws. And so really, what we see Jesus doing as he's walking through this is he's exploring this concept of the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. Has anyone heard these two terms before? A little bit. So this is something, as a police officer, I had to navigate all the time. So we've got lots of long books with weighty stuff in them talking about legal process and different penal codes and everything. I've got a slide in there about, I think it's a offense. You can get a little taste for some of the jargon. So, for example, you can get a citation and even be arrested for being in a public roadway, for standing in a public roadway as a pedestrian. A public roadway is any actual street, everything from Interstate 35 out here to the street in front of your house. The charge is called pedestrian in the roadway. It's pretty straightforward. If there's a pedestrian in the street, there it is. Section 552.006 of the traffic code. If a pedestrian's in the street and there's a place available to not be in the street, it's an offense. So any offense is an arrestable offense, generally speaking. Now, generally we don't do that because jails are small and you can't just put everybody in jail. So stuff like this, you would generally get a citation for. But the option is there to be arrested for this, right? That's the letter of the law. Human in the street, offense, right? But when they wrote this law, what was the spirit of the law? What were they trying to achieve by putting this in the law books? Safety, right? Trying to keep people from getting hit by cars. So if I'm out there and I'm enforcing the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, and I see someone in the street, I have to look. And are they being safe and responsible? Are they looking both ways? Are they paying attention to what's going on in the world around them? Is their head buried in their phone, right? If they're being safe in the doing of it, if I'm enforcing the spirit of the law, then I can say, the spirit of the law is satisfied. They're being in the street in a safe manner. Does that make sense? Right. And so that's this difference, right? And the Pharisees had drifted much more towards the letter of the law and away from the spirit of the law. And that's kind of what Jesus is coming in and laying this groundwork for. So, skip the section. So as we go through the Sermon on the Mount, you have this couplet that Jesus uses to start almost every section. You have heard it said, he's referring to the letter of the law, but truly I tell you, here's the spirit of that law, right? And additionally, the Mosaic law kind of speaks to this very corporate set of rules that apply to the nation as a whole, and Jesus is coming in and laying this very tangible personal layer to all the laws as they apply to us as individuals. So, next slide, or I guess maybe the last slide. Back into verse 38. There we go. You have heard it said, the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This concept is called lex talionis, so the law of exact retaliation. We first see it pop up years before in the Code of Hammurabi and some other ancient legal texts. And in the strictest sense, it's basically samesies, right? The punishment must be exactly equal to the crime. You punch me in the face, I get to punch you in the face, right? You kill somebody, you get killed. However, in practice, that doesn't fit really well, because like if you kill one of my cows on accident, I'm not going to go kill one of your cows. I'm going to take one of your cows to replace the one of mine you killed, right? So, or something deemed equal. So we move forward to the time of Jesus, and this system has developed into kind of a lot of legal process. Courts and judges and a lot of the fines and punishments were primarily financial. They weren't out chopping people's hands off for stuff, right? Not in this context anyways. There was a financial consequence if you wronged somebody. But the courts of the time, the judges, would still look to this eye for an eye principle as the standard as they were reviewing cases and making judgments. So this is our letter of the law of that time, right? A hard standard of equal balance for both sides. So now, jump forward to verse 39, and we start to explore our spirit of the law in contrast. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other also. Is that 39 or is that's 40, right? Okay. Oh, there's the first part of it. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Right? Y'all got that in there? Oh, I read it. Y'all, I've been at camp all week, man. Y'all. All right. So we see the word evil here in this first line. For us in English, evil is a really strong word. That's like top tier bad guy stuff, right? We a lot of times will tie it into something involving Satan, the devil, right? But in this context, what we see here, this word evil in the Greek is poneros, and it's more of a general descriptor for anything that's bad. For instance, you could use it to describe someone who acts bad or makes bad choices. You would say if a child snuck into the cookie jar before dinner, he was acting poneros, right? You could use it to describe the condition of someone who's sick or ill or diseased. If you're feeling under the weather, you're poneros. If Donnie had to miss worship practice because he was sick, you would say, Donnie was paneros, right? He was off from the norm. Donnie never misses worship practice. Or even to describe a situation that was perilous or difficult or toilsome. If you had to dig a hole in the earth with a shovel, that would be paneros. So two important things. One, paneros doesn't have a derivative connection with the devil. It doesn't speak to any kind of evil spiritual influence. And two, it's not talking about murderers, rapists, robbers, etc. There's different, stronger Greek words that apply to those kinds of offenses and the people that commit them. So when we're talking here, it's about a generally bad person who is doing something bad to you. So right off the jump, Jesus has consolidated the group of people that he's referring to with this. And the Jewish people present in the crowd would have understood that he's not about to tell them, this is how you deal with a guy who kicks in your door with a sword, I guess, for the time. I had gun written, but that's not applicable. It's not a direction for how to interact with people who are intending grievous harm on you. So, 39b, the slapping of the cheeks. A lot of times I see this taken out of context and used, weaponized almost, to say that we as Christians should be passive, that we should allow ourselves to be abused or beaten up without retribution, or as an indictment when we as Christians are proactive, when we are offensive, right? And we know the Bible doesn't call us to be doormats. So let's unpack it a little bit. Culturally, at the time, slapping somebody, though not nice, rude, wasn't terribly high on the use of force scale. However, a backhanded slap was a huge deal culturally at the time. Yeah, right? I know, like, this is way different than this, yeah? You gotta wind up for that guy. It's a big deal. So they think people are generally right-handed. So a slap on the left cheek would be a standard open-handed slap. Slap to the right cheek is coming from the other direction, inferring that it's the far more insulting slap. A backhanded slap was such a big deal. It carried this cultural and social kind of subtext of you're a lesser person. It's an insult to your character, to your reputation socially. It was a huge deal at the time. So much so that if you backhand slapped somebody, they could sue you and take you to court, where a judge would arbitrate and decide if your backhanded slap was appropriate or if you acted inappropriately. Like that big of a deal, right? So, we know from our previous walk up to this point through the Sermon on the Mount that generally speaking, Jesus isn't talking about the practical application of these, of the laws, but more the spiritual application, the posture of our heart as we navigate these situations. So, as we start to see this picture that he's painting here, he's using as an example their cultural understanding of an open versus backhanded slap to articulate how we should be posturing our hearts when offense comes our way, whether small or huge, right? We should not only not be offended by the open-handed slap, we should be prepared to receive the backhanded slap as well. We should be prepared to have an offense that damages our reputation in the public sphere. And not only do we not have the right to be offensive back, to slap back, we don't have the right to escalate and punch them. We don't even have the right to reprise at all. And we don't even have the right to be offended by either slap in the first place. The only right we do have in that situation is the right to forgive. Are you willing to give up your right to be offended? Verse 40. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give them your coat as well. I have a tunic picture up here. It's actually a picture of a whole guy in the outfit, the tunic and the cloak. Some of the translations will say tunic and cloak. It's dark, you can kind of see it, but the cloak is the outer garment, the tunic's kind of the long long shirt thing he's wearing underneath. In the culture, if you owed a debt to somebody and you took it to court, the judge could award them literally the clothes off your back if you had nothing else to pay them with. And so what we see him talking about here is you wronged somebody. You are in debt to somebody. The judge has ordered that you give them your tunic. The interesting caveat is with the cloak. If they were awarded your cloak, they had to give the cloak back by nightfall every day. It was deemed an essential piece of clothing, essential to your survival. It protected from the elements, kept you warm, kept the sun off of you. So every night, if somebody was awarded your cloak, they would have to give it back to you before nightfall. Weird, right? What we see is Jesus calling us, and remember, in this situation, in this example that Jesus is giving, you're in the wrong. You have wronged them in such a way that they took you to court. The judge agreed and awarded them literally the clothes off your back. It's an extreme situation because you don't have anything but the clothes to pay them back with. So he's presented a situation that they're culturally familiar with, and he's put it on the very extreme side. Jesus says, if you are ordered to give them your tunic, give them your cloak as well. Go above and beyond to make them whole. Even though the court can't require you to give them your cloak, you should voluntarily give it, sacrifice it to make them whole for the debt that you incurred with them. And so this is being sacrificial, not in a giving sense, but being sacrificial in a making someone else whole that you've wronged sense. So this is coming from the wrong side of an equation and sacrificing of yourself to make right with the other person, to not have bad blood, to not build a wall between you. Even though the court can't require it, Jesus calls us to voluntarily give above and beyond what we're required. Are you willing to sacrifice to give up your right to possessions, even from a position of wrong? Verse 41. Bloop. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. This was the Roman practice of impressment. It actually goes further back than that, but the Romans used it a lot. It's called impressment. A soldier could force someone to carry their gear for a mile. It's actually 1,000 Roman paces, which oddly is really close to an actual mile. It was Roman law at the time. It was widely practiced in the Roman Empire. There were outposts and garrisons scattered everywhere. Roman soldiers were all over the place. So getting caught up in this was a pretty frequent thing. A Roman soldier's gear, I read some estimates, anywhere from 80 to 120 pounds, which I think is pretty on par with what soldiers today carry around. Rob, back there. Yeah, Rob agrees. Very heavy, not an easy load to carry. I have a funny picture. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, about like that. Probably less trendy than that's a real thing too, by the way. They're not cheap. It's like $800 for a giant JanSport. So the Jewish people really, really, really resented this law. They hated that a Roman soldier could force them to involve themselves in their military establishment. So much so that Jewish people would go out of their way to avoid an area that they knew soldiers were preparing to move around in. Additionally, it was very common for Jewish people, really anybody in a Roman area, a Roman-controlled area, to have a stake driven into the ground 1,000 paces from their house or from the city gates. So they knew exactly how far they had to go. That's how common this was, how frequently it happened. Interestingly, this practice is also where we get the phrase, to go the extra mile. It comes from someone willing to go above and beyond in their impressment service. It was such a unique and servantly impressive feat that the phrase continues on to today. We still use it. So by and large, across the empire, I imagine, if you were impressed upon to carry a Roman soldier's stuff, you were not super excited about this road trip you were getting to go on. It's heavy stuff, not super far to walk, but not short, and you've got to walk a while back to your house, right? So as a Roman soldier, if you're impressing upon somebody to carry your stuff, you're expecting them to be grumpy, to not be happy, and you know that as soon as you hit that mile marker, your stuff's on the ground and they're a dust cloud heading back, right? They're not giving you a high five and a thank you. So, very few Roman soldiers were believers. Imagine if a person impressed into doing this service appeared joyful in their service and went the extra mile with them. How much of a reflection of Jesus and the kingdom would that be? Plus, you're getting an opportunity to have a captive audience with a non-believer that you can just speak to you the whole time. So what is the spirit here, the posture of the heart that Jesus is speaking to in this verse? It's service. He's calling on us to have a servant's heart, and not just to serve when it's convenient and it suits us, not just when it's fun stuff to do, not just when there's benefit to us in the service. Jesus is calling us to serve even when it's unpleasant and hard and we don't want to do it. And he calls us to do it with joy. Are you willing to give up your rights to having and pursuing your own plans, to step out in service to others? Verse 42. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. So, the word we see in the first line there, ask, in the Greek that is aiteo. The translation of it into to ask is very appropriate, but there's this understood meaning with aiteo that the person asking has a legitimate need for whatever it is they're asking for, or they're asking out of requirement. So for example, and I don't have the verse up there, but Matthew 27, verse 58, after Jesus has died, Joseph of Arimathea goes up to Pilate and asks if he can have Jesus' body back. And the word they use there is aiteo, because he's asking out of requirement, out of need, to fulfill the Jewish burial customs with Jesus. Now, discerning need and wisdom, that's a whole different sermon for another time, but for our purposes in this verse, understand that it's specifically talking about someone who is asking out of genuine need. It's not, your Uncle Wally asking you for $1,000 to start his, business selling Nerf pool floats or something, right? And I do want to point out also that Jesus isn't saying to give out of your abundance. And though that's important and you should do it if you're blessed, give. Jesus is calling us here to just give. If someone comes to you with a genuine need, you should fill it to the best of your ability. See a need, fill a need. And it doesn't have to be financial, right? Or tangible even. Money, food, property. It doesn't have to be those things. Time is one of the most important things we possess, and to give of that is deeply moving. If someone's going through something, having a rough week, don't just send them a text. Be generous with your time. Go sit at a coffee shop with them. Grab some food. Sit on your front porch. Take a walk. Invest into them with your time. Generosity can take many forms. If someone you know is moving and asks for help, you should be there. Your nail appointment or having dinner with your friends can be rescheduled. If you see someone changing a tire on the side of the road, you should stop and help. But Coit, I don't know how to change a tire. You don't have to help them change the tire. You can hold a flashlight. You can wave cars so they don't get hit. You can keep them safe. You can talk to them, keep them company. Generosity takes so many forms. A lot of times we limit it to what we feel our capacities or our competencies are. We can only help in these things that we're abundant in, right? That's not the case, though. It's a posture of generosity, a genuine desire to help people when a need is seen. And that's taking it a step further, right? It's not even when someone comes to you for help. If you see a need, even if it's not voiced, the expectation is that you step up and fill it. Are you willing to give up your right to provision the right to live with a closed hand and hold on to your things, your finances, your property, your time. Are you willing to give up your rights for the sake of the gospel? This past week at youth camp, I met a pastor named Mike. Ooh, sorry. He used to be a youth pastor at a church in North Hollywood for about 15 years. I think this was back in probably the 90s. If you don't know, North Hollywood, not the nice part of town. Its rates of drug and gang violence are 3 times above the national average. Interestingly, I didn't know this, North Hollywood is the fourth highest crime city in all of California. It's higher than LA. So Mike tells me a story. I'll preface it. All gangs handle the process of leaving the gang differently. During the time Mike was pastoring in North Hollywood, the gangs in that area, they use the practice of jumping someone out of a gang. You've probably heard of jumping someone in. That's where they beat you up to get into the gang. Jumping out's the same thing, just on the exit side. Usually a little more intense, too, because they really don't want you to leave. I do have a picture. It's not the most fun picture, but that gives you an idea of the experience. Basically, you're surrounded by other members of the gang, usually a set number. Different gangs have different numbers, and you have to fight with them for a set amount of time. Generally, it doesn't go well for you because you're outnumbered. So, Mike tells me a story. You can flip back to the verse. So Mike tells me a story from his early in his time working there about a young man named Emil, who was about 15 years old at the time. Emil had a rough home life, gotten into gangs. I think he said he'd been running with his gang for about 4 or 5 years at the time, so since he was 10 or 11 years old. Stealing cars, burglaries, robberies, selling drugs, the whole 9 yards. Emil was involved in it, right? One day, Emil started showing up to their after-school program they had. Later on, Emil told him he had just started coming because it was free food and it was right near his house. I can jive with that. After coming and not really talking to a lot of people, but just kind of showing up and being around, Mike said Emil started showing up to their Wednesday night youth group. And there he started to talk to some people, started to open up a little bit, but he was still a pretty closed book. He said, and it was several months of that. And he said, after service one night, Emil came up to him and he was like, Pastor, I've decided I'm ready to give my life to Christ. Mike's like, man, that's so awesome. Let's let's set a time. We can sit down. I can kind of talk to you what the next steps are, what this process is going to be. Emil says, that's great, but first, I have to get jumped out of my gang. He said, and I want you to come with me and be my witness. And Mike says, okay. And he understands kind of generally what the practice is, but he doesn't really know what he's walking himself into. So a couple days go by. Emil calls him up, and he gives him the location and the time of where it's going to happen. So the day comes. Mike picks him up that evening and drives him to the location. And as they're driving over there, Emil's explaining to him kind of how it's going to go down. And he says, so, Pastor, under no circumstances can you jump in, can you try and help me, can you try and stop it? He said, you've got to stay on the side. He said, if you do try to intervene, he said, at best, you're going to become part of the beating. He said, at worst, they may just shoot both of us. Mike's like, what have I gotten myself into? So they pull up to the park, and Mike says he can see, pretty good-sized group of guys over by a light post. And there were females there too. But so as they walk up, Emil exchanges a few words with one of the older gentlemen there, presumably leadership. And very quickly, he's surrounded by 8 guys, 8 other members in this gang. He said just moments after that, the older gentleman looks down at his watch and says, now, yells it out. And Mike said those next 2 minutes were 2 of the longest minutes of his life. He had to stand by and watch as these 8 guys just mercilessly beat Emil. Punched, kicked, stomped on him. Nothing was off limits. The 2-minute time hits, and the older gentleman is watching his watch, and he yells, it's done. Immediately, all 8 of the guys stopped hitting him. But each one of them spit on him before they walked off. And Mike said just as quickly as it had all started, all the gang members had left and they were alone in the park. So Mike ran over to him. He said Emil's face was so swollen and bloody that he could barely tell who he was. Bruises and cuts and all over. They found out later Emil had a severe concussion. He had gotten 3 teeth knocked out, 2 more shattered, broken 2 ribs, and his left arm was badly broken. So Mike said at that point, the most profound thing he has ever experienced happened. He said he was helping Emil up. Emil had his arm around his shoulders. He got him up, and Emil said, "All right, Pastor, now I'm ready to follow Jesus." Emil had found something he was willing to give up his rights for, that he was willing to sacrifice for, that he was willing to leave everything he knew behind for, and it was Jesus. Emil knew he couldn't continue to live the way he was living and follow Jesus. He knew he had to give up his right to be offended and to respond in anger. He knew he had to give up his right to possessions and make the significant sacrifice to pay the debt he owed to his gang in getting jumped out. He knew he had to give up his right to pursue his own personal plans and desires to begin following Jesus. He knew he had to give up his right to provision, the right to the security and the safety that he had known with that gang that had become his family over those years. Most of us will never be in a position where we have to get jumped out for Jesus. But would you if you had to? Would you endure that to follow Jesus voluntarily? Or would you rather stay where it's comfortable, where you get to hold on to your right to be offended, to keep your own plans and provisions and possessions? Or like Emil, are you willing to risk it all, to give up your rights for the sake of the gospel? In 2 Corinthians 12:10, Paul says, "That is why I take pleasure in my weakness, and in the insults, the hardships, the persecutions, and the troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Our response is the key in these passages. Jesus puts the ball in our court. Each of these scenarios Jesus presents requires us to make the choice. It's up to each of us individually to make the conscious choice every day to give up our rights and live for the sake of the gospel. I want to leave you with a quote by John MacArthur from his commentary on the book of Matthew, and it's specifically about these verses we were exploring today. "Let us not be stingy in our dealings with men. There are certain things that must be done, but let us go beyond the must and do our duty with a smile and with a generous kindness. It is not enough to pay our servants or employees. Let us be thankful for their service. It is not enough to pay our debts. Let us give the word also of appreciation. It is not enough to simply do the work for which our employer compensates us. Let us do it with cheerfulness and eagerness, willing to finish a piece of necessary service, even at cost to ourselves. As the followers of Christ, we are to be stars bearing our light on the vault of night, flowers shedding sweet fragrance on the world, fountains rising in the arid wastes, always giving love and helpful ministry to this thankless and needy world. Dear Lord, we come to you today in thanks. Thanks for the opportunities you've given us. Thanks for the comforts and the pleasures of this world. Thanks for the abundance that we live in. Lord, I ask you that you would break everyone's heart in this room today, that you would break their hearts for you, God. That you would encourage them, that you would spark them, that you would drive them with a desire to give up their rights for you. That you would make them hungry for opportunities to display their brokenness for you. That you would give them opportunities to show other people what the life of giving up your rights for the kingdom looks like. The benefits, the blessings, and the glory that comes from that. I pray that for everyone in this room today, that over this next week you would put someone in their path that they could be a mirror of you, that they could speak your word to, that they could give a small glimpse of what it looks like to live a life without rights, to live a life where the rights were voluntarily given up for you and for the kingdom. Lord, we love you. We thank you. In your holy name we pray. Amen.